Yeah, I think my screen is visible as well. So I'll start now. Are you ready, PK? Should I start? Okay, yeah. Perfect. Thank you, ma'am, for being here. So my thesis is titled Personal Narratives in Online Political Discussions. I'm Tejasvi Chebrolu, and my advisor is PK. So I'll be talking about what we'll broadly cover. So we'll be first talking about the problem and the motivation that we have, which is, can personal narratives help in political discussion? Then I'm going to talk about the various computational tools I use. So, what did I use? What kind of computer science methods did I use? The first chapter is about how personal narratives can empower politically disinclined individuals. The second chapter is what is the role of these personal narratives in cross-partisan discussions. Then we'll talk about what I'll take away from the project and what's next and what were the limitations. So the problem that we were broadly trying to answer is that online political discourse is challenging. So this is full screen. Actually, this is because I'm mirroring my laptop, so they see the whole. Yeah. So the problem is online political discourse is challenging. So, and why is that important to understand and see and to fix is because it is extremely crucial for democracy. There's a lot of knowledge that the voters can understand if they talk about politics. At the same time, talking about politics also can enhance tolerance in these voters. But unfortunately, a lot of them avoid it. This might be with disagreement with the current status quo of politics being discussed, lack of knowledge. If I don't know about political strategies, I can't really talk about politics, and the hostility that they face because political discussions are dominated by a vocal and often polarized minority. So what happens is this creates hostile environments and alienates people who don't really talk about politics a lot. And for the purpose of this study, we're going to call them PDIs, or politically disinclined individuals. And finally, just to summarize what happens if you don't talk politics, or only if a few people talk politics, is that you have a lot of polarization and you end up having echo chambers. So the question we were trying to answer is, how can we foster broader and more constructive participation in online political discussions from everyone? So the way we wanted to do this is use something called personal narratives. Simply put, personal narratives are short and first-person accounts which talk about things that happened in your real life. So for example, the statement, I get the second dose in 3 weeks, just got my first dose Tuesday and I'm just getting over the side effects from it, is a personal narrative because the participant is talking about something that happened in their real life. An example of a non-personal narrative or not a narrative is, yeah, I thought that was pretty obvious, but apparently not. Here, you don't really understand what is happening about the user in real life. It's just a blanket statement. So, this is the link that I got in the email. In your in my in my thesis defense. Who sent it? Hari Prasad. No? Okay. Is it the wrong one that I joined? Okay. Okay, so the first question we need to ask is, why might these personal narratives help? The first thing is that they provide a low barrier to entry. So unlike other topics where you need formal knowledge, you can use personal narratives because they rely mostly on experience, because that's how they're defined. Research has also found that they humanize the speaker, foster empathy and trust amongst people, and they've also been shown to increase respect across various political divides. Francesca Polletta, one of the famous authors on personal narratives, talks about personal narratives as extremely equalizing because everyone has a story to tell. On the other hand, it's also important to keep in mind that personal narratives are not a magic bullet, right? So they can do things which might affect discussions negatively. For example, they can reinforce in-group identity, which can cause to even more polarization, and platform affordances like likes and shares that you see online. They actually can amplify certain content because you are creating stories that work towards these likes and shares and not actually tell you things. And more importantly, and why we wanted to study this is because the real world impact was unclear on how personal narratives might help, especially in cross-partisan contexts. So we asked two questions in the thesis. The first question was, do personal narratives help politically disinclined individuals, which are PDIs, engage more in political discussions? And the second question is, how do personal narratives function in cross-partisan discussions? So the data set that we used, so we used the push shift Reddit archive, and we took data from 2015 to 2021, but we focused only on 2020 to 2021 for analysis. The reason why we took this broader data set will be explained in a bit. So we essentially ended up having 520 odd US focused political subreddits. We analyzed around 26 million users. We removed bots and moderation bots like automate moderator, etc. And we just focus on the interactions between the comments, not particularly the comment itself. So now I'll jump into what the computational tools were. So the first thing we need to look at is actually estimate the ideology of a particular user. And this is where we needed a lot of data. And our underlying assumption was political homophily. So people in political subreddits are going to talk about politics. And if you have likes or karma on Reddit, you will actually, it's indicative of the fact that you are, part of this political community. And the assumption is that there is an underlying latent space that we can discover, which is the ideology. So what we did is we took all the data from 2015 to 2021 and created a matrix, which and we call this the user subreddit matrix. And what this essentially had, every cell, for example, if we are in the ith column in the jth row, this corresponds to the ith user having n scores. So we look at quantifying the positive engagement, which is scores comments with score greater than 1. So let's say in a particular subreddit, you had 534 comments where the scores were, the sum of all your comments were 534. We ended up putting 534 in that cell. And the idea was we wanted to do a correspondence analysis, which finds one particular dimension across all the dimensions that we've collected. And this single dimension is what we call the ideological dimension. However, as you might have noticed, we used 26 million users. So it was not a one-step thing that we had to do. First, we found the dimension by actually going through all the users' scores greater than 10 for each subreddit, find that dimension, and then map the remaining users onto that particular dimension. And for validation, we used self-reported user flares. So Reddit allows you to declare yourself as any of these particular and more. And we wanted to see whether our the continuous boundary that we had, whether we could actually place it onto this scale. So on the leftmost, you have the democratic socialists who have a score of -1. Obviously, we scaled it so it's, your mean is 0 and your standard deviation is 1. So on the left, you have all the socialists, and then on the right, you have more of the conservatives. And we applied that to the similar thing to subreddits as well. And you can see this clear demarcation. On the left, you have the more liberal and ones, and on the right, and for example, Joe Biden is a disaster, is 4 standard deviations or 4.5 standard deviations away. So the idea here is we wanted a continuous scale so that we could represent ideologies, because as we know, they're not binary. So now that we have that, we needed a way to classify the stories as well. The way we operationalized what a personal narrative was is actually different from how research actually describes it, which is with a strict Lebovian structure, which has various things like a theme, a setting, an action, etc. And instead, we just focused more on first person, which were really relatively small because we were looking at social media stories. And this comes from the second citation that I've put up. The model we used was a Distelbert model, and we built on prior work by Falcon Lapesa and Antonio K. And the idea was to, initially we started experimenting with LLMs, and we realized that for encoder tasks like this, a smaller BERT model is what works best. And the data set for this was 2,000 manually annotated Reddit comments. So we had an initial seed set that we collected from the Falc and Lapesa model, and we filtered it out to actually find narratives that actually fit our operationalization. And on the screen, you can see some example comments of what a classified story looks like. So yeah, here are some metrics. Again, the key one to focus here is on the macro average F1 score of 0.82. So this is roughly saying that our classifier is actually pretty robust. And what we did was we did a 5-fold classification. So this is actually a classification average over 5 folds, not just one, just to ensure that we had more, we had more robustness for our classifier. The last thing that we needed to do is also operationalize politically disinclined individuals. So the basis for this operationalization was twofold. The first thing we wanted to look at was users who very rarely speak in political subreddits. And the second set of users that we wanted to look at were political newcomers who are new to politics on Reddit and basically have not been talking politics anywhere else. So the way we classify least politically active users is if you commented in a political subreddit in, let's say, February 2021, but you were in the bottom 25% of political comment activity over the previous 12 months. So all the users belonging to this group, we termed as least politically active. In a similar fashion, we said, if you commented in a political subreddit this month, but you had 0 political comments in the previous 12 months, but you were active elsewhere on Reddit, we said you were a newcomer to politics, even though you're used to Reddit's dynamics of speaking online. And finally, we needed a comparison group. So our comparison group was actually the most politically active users. So users who were in the top 25 percentile by past 12-month activity. So now that that's out of the way, the first chapter we're going to talk about is how personal narratives and politically disinclined individuals how we can connect both of them. So we asked 5 research questions and 5 hypotheses, sorry, and 1 research question. The first hypothesis focuses around how personal narratives can be a lower barrier to entry into these discussions. The second one works on accessibility. How easy is it to access personal narratives as a way for you to reply to political comments? The third one focuses on belonging. How does using personal narratives in these kind of discussion actually get you back into that community? And the fourth and fifth hypotheses and the research question were focused more around how the community values PDI personal narratives. And the way we wanted to do that was via comment scores. So yeah, the first question was we asked was, do PDIs use personal narratives more than active users? And on the right, this graph tells you the mean personal narrative usage for various user groups. As you can see, the least active users and the newcomers significantly use PDIs more than the most active users. And the interpretation here is that narratives are actually a low barrier entry point into these discussions. So hypothesis was around whether or not personal narratives have the ability to attract more replies from PDIs. So the graph here actually tells you the mean probability of receiving a reply for the 2 user groups, which are least active users and political newcomers. And on the left, you can see that other comments generally have lower scores than if you generally have a lower probability of getting a reply from a PDI than with personal narratives. And the interpretation again here is that these personal narratives actually seem to draw PDIs into political discussions better than any other type of comments that you might put out. So the next question we wanted to ask was, once you do have these PDIs and you use these PDIs, are they more likely to come back and interact again in that political subreddit? So here the graph shows you actually the mean probability of returning next month. And the x-axis tells you if they used a personal narrative in that month or they didn't use the personal narrative in that month. And as you can see, there's a significant jump when PDIs actually use personal narratives. And the interpretation again here is that these narratives actually seem to encourage continued participation in these discussions. So finally, we wanted to look at how these contributions are perceived, right? And does the community as a whole actually like these contributions? So the graph here actually tells you the mean score that they received. Various user groups receive for personal narrative comments and for other comments. It's interesting to note here, and this ties in with our political homophily assumption about ideology, the fact that most active users are the ones who get higher scores. And this makes sense simply because they're the ones who understand the nuances of that sphere, public sphere. And there is a perception gap that exists. There are certain things that will get higher scores and certain things that don't get higher scores. And PDIs, by definition, of people who don't participate in these communities, their score is actually lower than most active users. However, what is interesting to note here is that the personal narrative scores that PDI get is significantly higher than their other comments. So if you see here, the personal narrative scores for the least active users is 2.72 versus 1.55 for other comments. And similarly, for the newcomers, it's 2.28 versus 1.27. And the idea here is that the personal narratives actually reduce the score gap between PDIs and the most active users. So the interpretation we drew from this was, while PDIs face a perception penalty because they're not part of the in-group, these personal narratives are actually really helpful and bridge this gap. Important thing to note here is all of these results are statistically significant. We have p-score is less than 0.05. So what were the key takeaways from this project? The key takeaway is that personal narratives have the power to empower the politically disinclined. So PDIs use these narratives more frequently. They get higher engagement from PDIs if you use a personal narrative. Using such narratives actually leads to higher retention of these users, and these narratives are perceived positively by the community and actually help offset the lower comment scores that PDIs typically get. So all in all, we have strong evidence that personal narratives actually facilitate PDI participation. So the second part of this thesis revolves around cross-partisan discussions, wherein we wanted to analyze whether personal narratives have the power to bridge divides across political ideologies. And to do that, we asked three questions. First question is, are personal narratives used less frequently in cross-partisan interactions than in co-partisan interactions? So we wanted to see whether these personal narratives are tied to risk or they're tied to solidarity. And then the second hypothesis we asked is, how are these cross-partisan narratives actually received? Do they get higher scores or lower scores? And if they do get higher scores, that means that there is respect when you use personal narratives in cross-partisan discussions. And if you have lower scores, you're probably going to see polarization. And the third hypothesis we asked is, do using these personal narratives elicit more replies from the opposing partisan? So if I use stories in cross-partisan discussions, do I get more engagement? And we wanted to check one final thing, is whether these replies that we get from cross-partisan narratives, are they less hostile or are they more hostile? We wanted to see the measure of quality of replies you get when you use stories. So the first hypothesis was personal narratives are used less frequently in cross-partisan interactions than in co-partisan interactions. So the graph here shows the mean personal narrative percentage, usage percentage for various groups. So on the top, you have left-right, which is a right-leaning user replying to a left-leaning user's comment, and co-right is when a right-leaning user replies to a right-leaning user, and so on and so forth. And what we find here is that cross-partisan interactions, so especially left-right and right-left, exhibits significantly lower usage of personal narratives than co-partisan interactions. So the interpretation here is that although people talk about how personal narratives can be used to bridge divides, users actually seem to be hesitant to share personal stories with opposing partisans. So the second hypotheses that we wanted to discuss were, how are these cross-partisan narratives actually received? So if there is a higher karma, which is a comment score, that means that there's more respect. But if there's lower karma, it means there's more polarization. And the score here, the graph here again shows you the average score that you get for when the user is left-leaning and when the user is right-leaning in the opposing partisan. And you see that personal narratives generally score a little bit higher. So what are the findings here? So when right-leaning users are replying to left-leaning users, in left-leaning spaces rather, sorry, personal narratives actually receive significantly higher karma than non-narratives. And the idea here is you do get higher karma, which is respect for right-leaning users in left-leaning spaces. However, the inverse is not true. When you have left-leaning users replying to right-leaning users in the right-leaning spaces, there is no significant difference in the karma for personal narratives versus non-narratives. So neither it's not lower nor is it higher. In fact, there's no change. So neither H2A or B is supported for left to right. And this is interesting to talk about, and we'll talk about this slightly later. But the interpretation here is that actually these narratives can improve reception for conservatives in liberal spaces, but not the other way around. So we also wanted to check, right, whether personal narratives actually get more replies from the opposing parties. And here you have the probability of you getting a reply from the opposing partisan if you use a personal narrative or if you don't use a personal narrative. As you can tell from the graph that there is no significant increase in the probability of getting a reply from the original commenter, whether it's a left-leaning commenter replying to a right-leaning commenter or the other way around. And what we get at here is that personal narratives actually don't seem to overcome barriers for direct engagement, right? When you're replying across divides in this particular context. So finally, we want to check what the quality of these replies were. So were they more hostile or less hostile? And the finding here, as you can tell, is that the likelihood of the reply from the original commenter being toxic is there's no difference, right? Whether it's a whether it's a personal narrative or not a personal narrative. So personal narratives don't necessarily reduce hostility, but they don't necessarily increase it as well. So there's probably no change. So the key takeaways here is, unlike with politically disinclined individuals, for cross-partisan discussions is slightly different, and it's a mixed picture. So personal narratives, as we discussed before, are shared less often across party lines. There is a reception boost for right-leaning users in left-leaning spaces. Their personal narratives don't increase direct replies from opposing partisans, nor do they change the hostility level. So although they do have some potential to bridge divides, but the effects are limited and asymmetric. And this asymmetricity is, and what we hypothesize in our paper, is probably because of the different kinds of values and the discussion that happen in various spaces. And future studies can actually work on understanding and doing a qualitative analysis of those comments. So finally, we wanted to talk about the dual role of personal narratives. So personal narratives definitely do empower PDIs. So they can lower barriers, encourage participation, improve retention, and enhance community perception for less engaged users. But while bridging divides, it's only partially true. So they're less used in cross-partisan contacts, unfortunately. They can improve reception, especially for right-leaning users in left-leaning spaces, which does suggest potential for empathy and respect, as is in line with literature. But there is limited impact in terms of direct engagement or reducing hostility in replies. And this asymmetry suggests that context of these personal narratives and the identity of the user actually does matter when talking about stories. So finally, we wanted to discuss what this means for various stakeholders involved in this, especially for online communities and platform design. And I think reviewers pointed out that Habermas actually talks about this, and your public sphere actually should have discussions that are rational and which make sense from critical thinking. But we actually want to encourage the other thing. So there are subreddits like r/moderate politics that don't allow any stories, and they require fact checks for every single comment or post that you put up. And what this leads to is again, the thing that we talked about is this alienating of PDIs that happens. So the goal should be to encourage personal narratives for online communities because this can, create inclusivity and attract and retain newcomers. And we should also highlight such positive narratives that could set examples for these norms. For platform design, especially, just like how we have algorithms that tend to amplify shares and likes, we could have algorithms that could identify and surface constructive narratives when you're looking through a political subreddit. And we should consider features that actually support this kind of storytelling, wherein you don't have to give sources for your answer. At the same time, for understanding polarization, it's important to keep in mind that these aren't a magic bullet and can solve everything, but they do give you a pathway, especially for bringing more users into the conversation. So future work typically is restricted to all the things we didn't do. So the limitations are we only focused on Reddit. The answers would be different on Twitter or Facebook. Again, time specific is 2020 to 2021, which is pandemic. There was high amounts of polarization. So the results might differ when you look at other periods. Again, with any operationalization, the ideology and the PDI definitions of proxies, you could operationalize in your own way and you might get different answers. Again, we only analyze the text. We didn't look at other ways narratives are portrayed, for example, via images, videos, or even GIFs. Again, finally, we didn't analyze the content. We didn't actually understand what the stories were about. So we didn't look at topic analysis or the emotional tone. We just wanted to do a surface level understanding of the space. So future work obviously goes to rectifying the things that are part of the limitations. So can we do comparative studies across different platforms, countries? This was a US-based study, so can we do it similarly for other countries and for different time periods? At the same time, we need to also keep in mind that we have to actually analyze the content. So maybe you can do it both qualitatively and quantitatively, where we analyze the themes that these narratives belong to, the emotions that they talk about, and the topics. Again, multimedia narratives, can we do what is the impact of visual and video stories? Negative uses, right? So we talked about it only briefly, but can we look at how personal narratives can be used to spread misinformation or actually deepen the divides that already exist? Can we do work to actually isolate causal effects? This is a statistical based study. Everything's correlations. Can we look at causal effects? And can we follow the users over longer periods? So this thesis consists probably of first papers, personal narratives, empower politically disinclined individuals to engage in political discussions. This was submitted to the website conference in 2025. There's actually won the best paper award. We got an honorable mention for this. And the second paper is personal narratives in cross-partisan political discussions on Reddit. It was accepted for presentation at the ICA 25. Finally, I wanted to acknowledge everyone that helped me get through my thesis. So obviously, Professor Ashwin, who was my mentor at UT Austin, to talk about Harsha and Rohan, who actually co-authored another of my paper, which is unfortunately not in this thesis. Also want to thank Utkarsh and Chris for helping me with this work initially. Obviously, a lot of institutions were useful and helpful. So the CME at UT Austin, the Moody College of Communication, and obviously iHub here at IIIT Hyderabad. I wanted to thank Dr. Akansha and Dr. Radhika for actually reviewing the thesis and giving very useful feedback. That's all for me today. Thank you. Any questions?